Thank you for leading us to the throne where we get to hear from God. That's what we're going to do for the next minutes together. We're going to listen to God. Where we just sang, "This is our God." This is one of the most pronounced passages in the Old Testament where God says, "This is me. This is who I am. You want to know me? This is me." We're in the book of Exodus. It's a long book. It's the fifth longest book in the Bible. It's only the second book in order. So Genesis, if you want to turn to Exodus, flip through the 50 chapters of Genesis and get to chapter 3 of Exodus, where God is going to speak for the first time in Exodus, and he's going to reveal himself to Moses in a truly historic way today. I told you Exodus is for anyone who finds themselves in a hard and hopeless place. If you find yourself in a hard and hopeless place, hey, in the book of Exodus, you're in really good company. The Hebrews are slaves in Egypt in a hard and hopeless place. And it's going to be chapters before God's going to finally draw them out of the hands of the Pharaoh of Egypt. So what we're going to do is we're going to enter into that hard and hopeless place with the Hebrews. I want us to feel their misery and suffering so that when they're finally delivered, we can experience a measure of joy with them. And then maybe it'll cast a little bit of hope into our hard and hopeless situation. It'll give us some peace about where we are as we continue to trust God to deliver us out of our storm, out of our hard and hopeless place. I told you a couple weeks ago when we started this series that one of the things we're going to learn in the book of Exodus is transitions are tricky things, right? We find ourselves as a church in the middle of a major transition. You've experienced transitions in your life. Maybe you're in a major one right now. We tend to think of transitions as the turning of a page. So we transition from chapter 2 to chapter 3 by flipping the page. And I want to tell you that is not the way transitions usually work in your life and in mine. Definitely not in the book of Exodus. We need to think of transitions as entities unto themselves. Transitions are chapters unto themselves. The transition from chapter 2 to the next chapter takes an entire chapter just called the transition. It's not just the turning of a page. Transitions are chapters unto themselves. The Hebrews don't leave Egypt and the next day find themselves in the promised land, do they? No, it's a major transition for them, and it's a chapter unto itself. We're also going to learn that transitions beget transitions, don't they? Usually big transitions beget smaller transitions. We're going to see that in the book of Exodus. One major transition that's a chapter and entity unto itself, but it's going to beget lots of smaller transitions. It's going to be true for us as a church as well. Today, God calls and qualifies. Moses will be called and qualified today and next week, really. It's a 2-chapter calling of Moses. Exodus chapter 3, if you want to use the Pew Bible in front of you, our passage will begin on page 62. Let me remind you of the first 2 chapters. We've covered a lot of territory in the last 3 weeks, just in the first 2 chapters of Exodus. Remember, for more than 400 years, the Hebrews have been living in Egypt. And at first they were welcomed there as allies, but as time passed and their population grew, they became a national security threat to the Pharaoh who didn't remember Israel's goodness in saving Egypt during the time of famine. The king of Egypt decides to try to control Israel's population through slavery and infanticide, killing of the baby boys. But neither plan worked. Baby Moses was born, and he grew up living more like an Egyptian than a Hebrew, so that last week we found Moses as a 40-year-old adult having an identity crisis. Am I an Egyptian? Am I a Hebrew? And he concluded he was a Hebrew, but the other Hebrews didn't really recognize him as one of them because he was living a privileged life while they were slaves in Egypt. Okay. Because he killed an Egyptian who had been beating a Hebrew slave, Moses had to flee to a land called Midian, where he settled down as a sheep herder for 40 years. Okay. So when chapter 3 begins, we're starting chapter 3 today, we're going to find Moses nearly 80 years old. Get that? In 2 chapters, Moses has been born, and he's now grown to be 80 years old when chapter 3 begins. And after more than 400 years of God's silence regarding Israel in Egypt, God is going to now speak. You also need to know the pace of the book is about to slow down. We covered 80 years plus in 2 chapters, okay? 80 years plus. The rest of Exodus from chapter 3 to 40 is going to cover about a year and a half. Okay, so we are screeching now to a crawl for the rest of the book of Exodus. Okay, 3 points today in a historic passage. You're going to be very familiar with this text. Hope we'll learn something new together and walk away different as a result. 3 points today. First, God is a holy God. We're going to learn about God. God's going to reveal himself in this passage and next week's very clearly, and for the next several chapters. God is a holy God. Stands out big time in the text. Chapter 3 of Exodus, verses 1 through 6. Very famous. Now Moses was shepherding the flock of his father-in-law Jethro. We knew him as Reuel in chapter 2. He's now referred to as Jethro, and he's the priest of Midian. And Moses led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to the mountain of God, Mount Horeb. Mount Horeb. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from within the bush. Probably the angel of the Lord is not a pre-incarnate manifestation of the second person of the Trinity. Probably in the Old Testament, the angel of the Lord is not Jesus. It's a pretty big hermeneutical stretch to get there, okay? The text calls him the angel of the Lord, and Jesus, we know, is, first of all, not an angel. And there's a whole lot of other reasons why I don't think the angel of the Lord is Jesus. Let's just go with what the text says. It's the angel of the Lord here. Moses looked, and the bush was ablaze with fire, but it was not being consumed. So Moses thought, I will turn aside to see this amazing sight. Why does the bush not burn up? And when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, then God called to him from within the bush. And he said, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. God said, Do not approach any closer. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. He added, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And then Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. It was a smart move. Today's passage takes place at Mount Horeb, and a lot of the book of Exodus is going to take place at this site. Mount Horeb is another name for Mount Sinai. We know it as Sinai, and that's what it will be called later on in the book. Here, it introduces it as Horeb. In this passage, Moses shepherds his sheep to Mount Sinai. Later, he's going to shepherd God's people to the very same place where he will be given the law. A confident location for this mountain has not been had. In fact, 12 possible locations have been proposed, and it's probably one of them, but it might not even be one of the 12 that's been proposed. Nobody really knows. Let me show you a map. Mount Sinai likely is outside of Midianite territory toward Egypt, likely in what's called the Sinai Peninsula. For us, the technical term, we would say it's between the rabbit ears. Do you see the rabbit ears? Yeah, it's probably somewhere in between there, sitting on the rabbit's head. So you see Midian circled to the right in the southeast. That's where Moses is living as a sheep herder for the last 40 years. He's married into the family of Jethro, right? Well, he travels a great distance to find pasture for his flocks in the Sinai Peninsula, and that's probably where we're located now. Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai is there. You can see Egypt way up to the northwest, and straight north of Midian, you'll find Israel proper, the land, Jerusalem, right? The Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee, all that straight north of Midian. Okay, it tells you where we are. And everything in the book of Exodus is going to happen right here on this map somewhere. A lot of it takes place in Egypt, leaving Egypt, and then finding themselves in the Sinai Peninsula where Moses is going to receive the law, back at this same location. We don't know where it is specifically. Imagine our preoccupation with that location if we did know where it was. Maybe it's a good thing. So there, near Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, Moses sees an unusual phenomenon that warrants further explanation. It's a fiery bush. And he knows this fiery bush would have been consumed immediately. Remember, Moses is traveling with his herds. He spends the night with them. These aren't just day trips. He stays many, many nights out in this wilderness area, and he would sleep by fire. So, of course, he would know how quickly a bush like this will be consumed, and it's not. It gets his attention, okay? It's probably a small bush, probably only a few feet in diameter. Don't think of it as really large. It's probably small. It would sit right here on the front of the platform, okay? But it gets his attention. Let me show you this painting called Moses and the Burning Bush, an oil painting on canvas from the 17th century. This particular painting, I think, captures it well because often with these early paintings, it would have God coming out of the bush, not just the burning bush, but it would actually have God coming out of the bush as he speaks to Moses in their first of many encounters. The burning bush is the first miracle in the book of Exodus that unbelievers try to dismiss with natural explanations. You're going to find a lot of them. All of the 10 plagues, the parting of the sea, all of these miracles are going to be tried to be explained away with natural explanations. But rest assured, it's a miracle. This is a non-natural event. It is a supernatural event, a manifestation of the presence of God by fire. It's a good symbol for God, okay? Because God's presence is powerful and all-consuming. And because of that, God's dangerous. Fire is dangerous. You don't want to get too close to it. In the same way, God's presence is dangerous. It has to be managed carefully. So what does God say to Moses? First thing he says, Moses, Moses, here I am. Stop where you are. Stop right there. Do not come any closer, he says. That's close enough to me. Have you ever imagined God saying those words to you? We kind of imagine the opposite, don't we? That God's always saying, come here into my loving arms, instead of God saying, stay a safe distance away. Here he says, keep your distance for your own safety, for your own protection. From a holy God, keep your distance. Not something we tend to emphasize in modern Christianity, where we refer to God as daddy and think he's cool with it. Right? It's not the impression that Moses gets at all, is it? It's a fearful sight. This theme of God's holy presence is a major one in Exodus, first introduced here. Listen to all these firsts here. The very ground is called holy. And this word holy describes no other ground in the Bible. This is it. Holy ground. The noun holy appears 469 times in the Old Testament. This is the first one. The noun holy did not appear in the book of Genesis or in Exodus 1 and 2. This is the first occurrence of a noun that will go on to occur 469 times in the Old Testament. Holy ground, the first occurrence of that noun. Moses is instructed to remove his sandals, an invitation to worship a holy God. There are many references in the Bible to people removing their shoes, but this is the only one that connects the act with the presence of holiness. It's an important passage. And then, when God identifies himself as the God of Moses' ancestors, Moses covers his face out of fear, right? Of course he's afraid. Got this on a slide. It's as unsafe to look at God as it is to not listen to him. Listening is advised. Looking is not. Not at a holy God. Especially when you're a sinner like you and me. Especially when you're a sinner like Moses. How do you think he felt? Right? He's a murderer. We just learned that in the previous chapter. Moses is a murderer. And he was just told he's standing on holy ground in front of God. Of course he turns his face away in fear. We would too. Sinful people can't be in the presence of holiness without melting away like wax. But by the grace of God. Okay? This is Moses' calling. Moses will be called and qualified in chapters 3 and 4. It's a 2-chapter calling. It's going to take a while, this conversation between Moses and God that we just saw start. Here's what's fascinating to me. The holiness of God, right? It's a powerful thing. It's a dangerous thing. It's a fearful thing. We have to keep a safe distance away from the holiness of God. And yet God, in his holiness, invites Moses to be a deliverer. He calls Moses on holy ground to be a deliverer. And, get this, for the rest of Moses' life, Moses will be in charge of managing God's holiness. Half of the book and all of Leviticus is instructions about managing God's holiness in a way that protects sinful people from a holy God. Right? God wants to be among us, but he can't be among holy people. We die. God's holiness has to be managed carefully. There has to be a mediator, a priest, if you will, that manages the holiness of God in a way that protects sinful people. Moses, the murderer, is called to manage the holiness of God for the rest of his life. He'll spend the next 40 years doing so. Our God is a holy God. Second, and you know this, God is a promise-keeping God. There's one promise in particular that he made in Genesis that has yet to see fulfillment now for over 400 years, okay? And now God's going to remind Moses of what that promise is and articulate his intentions to fulfill that promise using Moses. God is a promise-keeping God. Let's pick it up in verse 7. The Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. He's a compassionate God, right? He sees and feels compassion for the Israelites under slavery in Egypt, verse 8. I have come down to deliver them from the hand of the Egyptians and bring them up from that land to a land that is both good and spacious, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the region of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, and mosquito bites, yes, even them. And now, indeed, the cry of the Israelites has come to me, and I have also seen how severely the Egyptians oppress them. Everything sounds good so far, right? Moses is listening, saying, this is good. This is good. God's finally heard. He's heard their cry, sees their oppression. God's going to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians. This is all good. And then verse 10. So now, go, and I will send you to Pharaoh and bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, or that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He replied, surely I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that I have sent you. When you bring the people out of Egypt, you and they will serve God here on this mountain. The end. And you're thinking probably what Moses was thinking. You call that a sign? How is that a sign? that after everything takes place, we're going to worship you and serve you here on this mountain? I need a sign, like now. I need to see something really cool to convince me this is all going to take place. It's a particular kind of sign that actually appears elsewhere in the Bible also, where God says it's going to require a measure of faith even to see this sign. Okay? And after you've expressed that measure of faith, you'll have the privilege of seeing this sign fulfilled. You'll worship me with those millions of Israelites out of Egypt here, back here at this place. Again, I think Moses' initial thoughts when God began to talk were, great! God's going to bring me and all the Hebrews to the promised land. Then verse 10 hits. And so now go. You go. What? Me? Am I alone? Are you talking to me? I'm going to go and do this? I love Moses' first words and Moses' second words in response to God. Did you see them? Pay careful attention to these details. His first words, when God said, Moses, Moses, he says, here I am. That's a Hebrew way of saying, yes, I hear you. I'm listening. What would you like? And then the very next words out of Moses' mouth after God says, you're the guy I'm going to use to go to Pharaoh and bring them out of Egypt is, who am I? Who am I? Expressing humility, unworthiness. That expression, who am I, in a similar context appears 2 other times in the Old Testament when someone humbly accepts a great assignment that they feel unworthy of. Okay? It's Moses expressing his humility, not declining the assignment. Moses has been a sheep herder for 40 years. He didn't feel qualified because he wasn't qualified. He didn't feel worthy because he's not worthy for the task. God is calling him, and God is going to qualify him. And God's going to keep his promises. He's a promise-keeping God. He's going to choose Moses in the process. What promise specifically are we talking about in this context? It's called the Abrahamic covenant. Okay? It's the promised land. The promised land is the land that God promised to give to Abraham and his descendants, right? The Abrahamic covenant is land and descendants primarily. How are we doing on descendants? We're doing great. Israel is 2 million plus at this point, right? We're doing really good on multiple descendants, more numerous than the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. But what about land? There's a specific land that God promised them, and for 400 years they've not occupied that land. That's what we're talking about. That's what God's now saying. I'm going to initiate the fulfillment of that promise. It's going to start with extracting Israel from Egypt. It's going to end when they enter into the promised land and occupy it. We learn three things in the text about the promised land, right? First thing he says is it's big, it's good and spacious, right? The second thing he says is it's nourishing. That's when he says it's a land flowing with milk and honey. This is the first occurrence in the Bible of that expression, a land flowing with milk and honey. What does it mean? The Bible Knowledge Commentary says this. The phrase, a land flowing with milk, means that Canaan was ideal for raising goats and cows. Feeding on good pasture land, the goats, sheep, and cows were full of milk. Flowing with honey means that the bees were busy making honey. So, milk and honey suggest agricultural prosperity. You understand? In the ancient world, that's your gross national product. Okay? That's your bank account. That's your national treasury. That's your savings. If you have agricultural prosperity, you are a prosperous people. Land flowing with milk and honey means agricultural prosperity. Goes on to say this is the first of numerous references in the Old Testament to the land flowing with milk and honey. So, it's a big land, right? It's good and spacious. It's a nourishing land, a land flowing with milk and honey, agriculturally prosperous. And third, it's occupied. This just complicates things, doesn't it? I mean, Moses is thinking, well, it's one thing to get the Israelites out of the grasp of Pharaoh, out of Egypt. That's a big job. But now we've got to go into an occupied territory. They're not going to just walk out and let us have it. They're going to put up a fight. And they do, don't they? Yeah, for 400 years, Israel hasn't lived there, and the occupants of the promised land have multiplied. Complicates things. So you can understand why God needs to say, I'll be with you, buddy. I'll be with you. I'm going with you into all of this. God promises Moses that the Israelites will return safely here and that his presence will go with him. Okay. God is a holy God and God is a promise-keeping God. Are you with me? Powerful text. Third and importantly, and I'm going to put a small twist on a familiar passage. Very important and famous Old Testament passage. God is a powerful God. God is a powerful God. Exodus 3, and we're going to finish the chapter starting in verse 13. Moses said to God, if I go to the Israelites and tell them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What should I say to them? This is Moses politely saying, what's your name? What's your name, God? Very famous passage coming up. Verse 14. God said to Moses, I am that I am. Notice the all capital letters there? That's important. And he said, you must say this to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, you must say this to the Israelites. The Lord, that's his name. Okay, that's his name. We're going to talk more about that. You see it's in all capital letters. The Lord. The God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial from generation to generation. Go and bring together the elders of Israel and tell them, the Lord, that's his name. He says it again. The Lord, the God of your fathers, appeared to me, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he said, I have attended carefully to you and to what has been done to you in Egypt. And I have promised that I will bring you up out of your affliction in Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and the Termites, to a land flowing with milk and honey. And then verse 18, the elders will listen to you. And then you and the elders of Israel must go to the king of Egypt and tell him, the Lord, that's his name. He says it again. That's his name. The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. So now let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness so that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. It's going to be the request, permission to go on a 3-day trip to worship God. The text does not say they'll be gone for only 3 days and then return. No, instead it says it will take them 3 days to get to the location where they intend to worship. That's all. Verse 19. God continues, but I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go. The elders of Israel will listen to you. The king of Egypt will not listen to you, not even under force. So I will extend my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders that I will do among them. And after that, he will release you. I will grant this people favor with the Egyptians, so that when you depart, you will not leave empty-handed. Every woman will ask her neighbor and the one who happens to be staying in her house for items of silver and gold and for clothing. You will put these articles on your sons and daughters. Thus you will plunder Egypt. And the chapter ends. The Hebrews who read these words generations later always smiled at the end of this chapter. The notion of plundering Egypt without a war. Yeah, that notion of plundering is a military term associated with gathering up the spoils after a battle. And by God using that term, it's God's way of saying, I'm declaring war on Egypt to get back the one they're holding ransom. I'm declaring war on Egypt. It's a holy war, which means God's going to fight the battle on behalf of the Israelites. They don't have to do anything. And the end of the day, they're going to plunder the Egyptians, taking back all that was taken from them. Told you in verse 18, it says that the elders of Israel will listen to Moses. In verse 19, the very next verse, Pharaoh will not listen to Moses. He was told this in advance, and yet Moses will still be surprised later on when Pharaoh puts up resistance and wonder, why has God put him in this situation? No, God warned him ahead of time. Pharaoh's not going to listen to you. It's going to take some work to pry Israel out of his hands. God's declaring war on the Pharaoh and the Egyptians because of how they've treated his people, Israel. And then our question is, can God win a war against the most powerful nation in the world? Right now, Egypt is the most powerful nation in the world at the time. Can God win this war? And that takes us to the name of God. Okay? I think there's a lot packed into the name of God that suggests that God's going to win this war. Notice the I am is capitalized in our text, and from it, we get the personal covenant name of God, which significance is revealed in this chapter, chapter 3, in chapter 6 of Exodus, big time, and in the 10 plagues, connected to all 10 plagues, the name of God. And then also big time in chapter 34, when they get back to Sinai, when God reveals himself to Moses in a very special way, and he gives a description of his character in chapter 34, connected to his name. So, who is sending you, Moses? I am is sending you. Or I am that I am is sending you. It's the personal covenant name of God comes from that phrase, okay? What does it mean? Well, let's look at the name. The name is 4 letters in Hebrew, YHWH. It's called the Tetragrammaton, 4-letter word, YHWH. Hebrew has no consonants. It's hard to read. They also do it backwards, making it even harder to read, okay? This is the personal covenant name of God using English letters for Hebrew letters. That's it. That's God's personal covenant name. You ever want to write it down? That's how you write it in English. Okay. It's the Tetragrammaton. We pronounce it Yahweh. We pronounce it Yahweh. It's the Hebrew pronunciation of those 4 consonants. Okay. To Latinize the pronunciation, you call him Jehovah. It's the same word. Jehovah translates those same 4 Hebrew letters, but it's Latinized. You can see that, right? The Y is pronounced Yah in Hebrew and Jah in Latin. The W is pronounced Wa in Hebrew and Va when it's Latinized. It's the same word, Yahweh, Jehovah, both referring back to the Tetragrammaton, the personal covenant name of God, Yahweh. In our English translations in the Old Testament, the way that word is displayed is Lord in all capital letters. Do you remember? We kept seeing that. The Lord, right? The God of your ancestors. The Lord, the God of the Hebrews. The Lord, the God of your ancestors. He's the one. All capital letters, that means Yahweh, Jehovah, the Tetragrammaton, the personal covenant name of God. But what does it mean? Context is important. Immediately after God discloses his name to Moses, right, he tells Moses what he's about to do. Seems as though the divine name is connected to God's unparalleled abilities. Maybe I am that I am is better rendered, I will be whoever I will be. And I'm about to show you what I mean by that, he says. You have to know the personal covenant name of God is more important in the book of Exodus than any other book in the Bible, okay? It's almost as though the book of Exodus, the entire book, is a commentary on the meaning of I am, of Yahweh, of the personal covenant name of God, I am. I will be whoever I will be. I'm about to prove it to you. The whole rest of the book, you're going to see the meaning of my name. I have freedom, it says, that you cannot imagine. I have power that you cannot comprehend. I have rights that you cannot fathom. I can do what I want, when I want, how I want, using whomever I want. And nothing can stop me, and no one can stop me, and everyone together can't stop me. I am. It's powerful, isn't it? It's God's sovereignty. I have the right to do what I want and the ability to do what I want. I will be whoever I will be. That's my name. And I'm going to prove it to you in marvelous fashion in the chapters to come. We're just getting started. Chapter 6, we're going to see it again powerfully. His name connected to his abilities and his rights to be whoever he will be. The 10 plagues connected to his name. I am Yahweh, his right and his ability to be whoever he will be. It's just as true today as it was back then. Did you know that? We worship this God who revealed himself to Moses that day. Same God today that no one can stop, that everyone together can't thwart his plans. That even today, he will be whoever he will be. He has that right. He has that ability in your life, in my life, in your family, in my family, in this church, in this world, in this universe. I am. I'll be whoever I will be. Grant, the worship team, as they make their way to the front, let's bow our knees before the great I am. And let's go before his throne, recognizing who he is, and let's pray. Would you pray with me? And for the reminder of who you are today, we give thanks. It's with fear and trembling we stand on holy ground in the presence of a holy God. And we know that you are holy. We know that you're a promise-keeping God. You've kept your promises to us as individuals and families, as a church. We're thankful that you're a promise-keeping God, that we can rely on you and you'll be faithful. Thank you that you're a powerful God, that you will be whoever you will be in my life, in our families, in this church, in the world, and that nothing can thwart your plans, the great I am. And so we bow before the great I am. We magnify and exalt your name today. And we invite you to be whoever you will be in our lives this week. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.